There are times when I get the distinct sense that all is not well, and that all that is being claimed is not, in fact, the reality. There is a deep seated tendency in India to settle for the second rate. The criticism made alike of government and non governmental institutions. So while we must strive for excellence in what we do and establish a culture of devotion to beauty, we must also guard against our acceptance of mediocrity.
So I met Mr. D as a result of our common interest in mental health. And soon after, the government of India commissioned a team of 10 under the leadership of Mr. Desiraju draft the first mental health policy for the country. Now, through this period, as much as he was advised by the collective wisdom of the team and by readings and evidence, equally he wanted to visit hospitals and felt the urge to visit homes of persons, particularly those disadvantaged, to understand the problems faced firsthand and the messiness, of course, of the real world. I think this informed the policy and created a robust document that would serve the person that it was intended to serve. Post his retirement, when he moved to Chennai, he joined the board of the Banyan Academy of Leadership. And in some ways it was meant to be, because it's really persons with mental health challenges, their caregivers, persons who experience health disparities, persons in socially disadvantaged positions that brought us together. In that sense, there was a common purpose really that established the connect. But gradually our relationship transitioned into something, a more sort of friendly one, where him, my husband, our extended network of friends, our doggies, we would hang out a lot together. We had a lot of fun, and these are memories that I'm going to cherish, recall with a sense of joy. Each of us has obviously taken away something from his life. And for me, 4 of his personality traits stand apart. The first is the sense of lightness with which he approached any task, whether it was the huge mental health policy or finding an oxygen bed for someone affected with COVID in recent times. He would pursue whatever the task on hand, small or large, with a sense of dogged determination and diligence, see it through to the very end, and ensure that it was complete, but post that, walk away from it and claim absolutely no credit. Now, that's a tall order, and that's a remarkable person. I wouldn't be able to do it, but he did it with a sense of ease. And that obviously indicates that ego really didn't feature very much in his life. He knew that whatever he did was larger than him. He was always the bigger person in relationships. And therefore, everything that he did, he realized was to better lives. And that, I think, gave him a sense of purpose and meaning. And you could see the sense of joy that he felt in doing whatever that he did. The second, his sense of accessibility and authenticity. Well, he would, during his years in service and after, receive innumerable emails, and very few went unanswered, or text messages or calls, because he believed that if he represented, if he were a public servant, that he needed to stand for values of equality and justice. And therefore, if someone was reaching out to him for support or help, he needed to respond, and respond equally, regardless of who the person was, which he did, and did almost obsessively, and never spoke too much about it. So you would see a whole lot of people, therefore, connected to him. I thought this is the norm, but then it was only later that I realized that I was spoiled by Keshav, Mr. D. And that is not really the norm. Not everybody is like this. Similarly, in his relationships, there was a great sense of devotion, whether to his sisters or his family or his dear friends, old me, known Pravesh, we knew for 30 years, me for 10 years, several others. There was a great sense. Each of us saw different facets, sure, but it was the same Keshav, and he was authentic. So he was himself all the while. And that again calls for a great sense of confidence and security, that wherever you are, with whoever you are, you're not making distinctions based on the person that you're with. Obviously, your conversations are there, but you're the same person. And that leads me to my third point, that he was human. So as much as we exchanged insights on issues of national importance or significance, there were several things that bothered us. about, going on in our country and in the mental health space or in public health. And as much as we spoke about that, equally, our conversations would never really end without some exchange of snarky remarks. And as much as I enjoyed the other conversations, this part was truly special. And I'm really going to miss this. And remember, there's not an ounce, as much as an ounce of malice, but the mischievous glint, the little pout, and that exchange, that just did it all. And finally, just the sense of devotion with which he cared for his friends, his loved ones, that we could rely on him and know that he was around and know that he would always be there, despite arguments, despite debates, and stand firm in your support and advise you on what was good for you and help you move forward in your journey of life. So for all of this and more, thank you, Mr. D, for the rich legacy that you left behind, for the person that you were, and the short period of time that I enjoyed, the deep relationship and the deep insights into your personality that I had access to, and the many learnings as a result. Thanks very much. We're all going to deeply miss you, but we will celebrate your life. And remember, most of all, to be human.
Their body image workshop is from when to when?
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for your patience. We're delighted to invite you to the inaugural lecture of the Keshav Desiraju Memorial Lecture Series, dedicated to a man who we all know and love, and whom to many of us embodied perfection, wit, brain, handsomeness, and so much more. We miss you dearly, Mr. D, and this is the start of what is so many more events we're going to do in your honor, and more importantly, to keep your memory alive. So without further ado, I'd like to call upon Mr. Kasturi Balaji, Director of Cognizant Foundation, to say a few words.
Good evening. Dr. Sanjeev Jain, Justice Prabha Sridevan, Ms. Mrinalini Ravi, Dr. Lakshmi Sundaram, Dr. Kishore Kumar, distinguished health professionals, members of the Banyan family, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin by saying that it was a privilege to have known Keshav Desiraju and to have served alongside him on the board of Cognizant Foundation. where he brought to the table a refreshingly different outlook towards not only healthcare, but also education and livelihood, the areas in which the foundation works. His approach was humane, but his focus was sharp and not surprisingly well-informed. His interactions with another former IAS officer on our board, Mr. N.R. Krishnan, several years Keshav's senior, were lively and informative. On a more personal note, we had a common interest in Carnatic music, another field where he made his mark as a writer. Cognizant Foundation's partnership with the Banyan goes back to the year 2016 with our support for its urban mental health program for 1 year. Cognizant Foundation supported Banyan again in March 2020 for the provision of pharmacotherapy to persons accessing clinical services under the Nalam Community Mental Health Program, both urban and rural. This was for 2 years from April 2020 to June 2022. Through this project, Banyan reached 1,655 beneficiaries, 910 of them in the urban areas, despite the constraints prevailing during the COVID pandemic. An impact study for the project completed earlier this year by the Center for Social Initiative and Management, CSIM, reported very positive findings. In the meantime, Banyan sought part support from Cognizant Foundation in June 2022 for the Center of Social Needs and Livelihood project, which caters to 1,250 patients and 6 caregivers of patients accessing Banyan's outpatient clinics and aftercare services in Chennai, Tiruvallur, and Chengalpet districts of Tamil Nadu for 3 years. This request was an extension to the previous project supported by Cognizant Foundation. Through this project, it is expected that with the provision of 3 kinds of support, social care, medical care, and caregiver support, the overall burden of the disease and the problem of homelessness would decrease, and a sense of well-being, security, worthiness, and identity would be promoted among the beneficiaries. Keshav Desiraju's influence over and accomplishments in the making of mental health policy are well known. It is indeed most appropriate that this lecture series on mental health is being started in his memory, and Cognizant Foundation is very happy to be part of the launch process. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Balaji. And we're so grateful to the Cognizant Foundation for all the support that's extended to the Banyan and similar nonprofit organizations doing good work in the sector. I'd now like to call upon Dr. Lakshmi Shankaran, Deputy Director, Banyan Academy, to introduce Dr. Sanjeev Jain.
Good evening to everyone. It's official that the Agni Nakshatram in Chennai is over. So if you're feeling hot, it's not true. That's a joke. Anyway, it's my pleasure to introduce you all to Dr. Sanjeev Jain, who was my professor at NIMHANS. We remembered him when he came in this, series of wonderful cars which were vintage. So that's the history of Dr. Sanjeev Jain, sort of a hallmark of the kind of work he does today. So I had to say that, Dr. Jain, I couldn't not resist it. So I'm proud to introduce him, and he was a close collaborator of Mr. Desiraju and a member of the National Mental Health Policy in 2014. He studied medicine at the Delhi University and did his PG at NIMHANS. He has been a Commonwealth Fellow at Cambridge and a co-director of the NIH Fogati Training and Mentorship Program. Currently, he is an emeritus professor at NIMHANS, Bangalore. Before this, the Dean of Psychiatry at the same institution. He is also a member of the Board of Trustees at the Banyan and an academic director at BAM. Dr. Jain's expertise ranges from the history of psychiatry, evolution of psychiatric services in Bangalore in India, from the period of British rule and subsequent developments in psychiatric genetics, I was looking at his biography and I was blown by the lot of, the number of times the word genetic popped up and then moving into history, which is really wonderful. So that's a very interesting part of his biography. He's also established a repository of archival documents on history of psychiatry in India and in Bangalore pertaining to the lunatic asylum, the Bangalore and the Mysore State Mental Hospital, All India Institute of Mental Health and now NIMHANS, and of course the Heritage Center, which has been set up. He is also a member of the committee for drafting the mental health policy document for India. A complete list of his published works can be accessed. He is currently working with BAM on the history of asylums in Kerala and Madras Presidency with Dr. Hom, Sareen, Narsimhan and Gopi Kumar. For this lecture, we welcome all of you, where Dr. Jain will delve into the evolution of psychiatry as a science, the history in India, pathway-breaking innovations in psychiatry, and its future within a comprehensive, multidisciplinary, techno-scientific framework. I'd like to conclude my introduction to Dr. Jain with a quote from Roald Dahl, whom we cannot, erase, despite him being politically incorrect, according to, the common narrative today. So he says, and above all, watch with glittering eyes the whole world around you, because the greatest secrets are always hidden in the most unlikely places, possibly the archives. Those who don't believe in magic will never find it. Thank you. Have a lovely evening. You can start and you project it.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Mr. Kasturi Balaji and colleagues at the Banyan for inviting me to this memorial lecture. As has already been am I audible over the fan? Is that better? Yeah. So thank you all for being here. And obviously we've come here to remember Mr. Keshav Desiraju. And I was fortunate enough to be a member of the Mental Health Policy Working Group in those years, couple of years that we tried to do this. And a substantial part of the initial debates or discussions were how to define mental illness. So we went through all the labels in the world and we ultimately came down with this. It's a substantial disorder of thinking, mood, perception, etc., which is more or less like what a layman's or what a common person would think of madness. It would not include mental illness, and we came up with this issue. The act itself is very interesting because it is specifies that the right to access mental health care is a right, but also following that, there are issues of community living, protection from cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, equality, information, confidentiality, personal contacts, communication, legal aid, complaints, and all that. It includes all establishments looking after the mentally ill, but does not include acknowledgement or roles of the family and family carers, and has many contentious issues like advanced directives and interfaces with disability acts, etc.
Now, why were we in this situation that we were debating or discussing these kinds of issues about mental health? Because in psychiatry, we have not discussed many of these issues, either within our wider society or within the profession, or indeed with the families. What is it that the existing methods teach us? The field of psychiatry has diversified into hugely different spaces. There are new treatments and technologies, from drugs, from genetic manipulation, from imaging, and from artificial intelligence and web-based services. These are completely new methods. And there are also new forms of exclusion, coercion, and control, which make all these technologies quite dangerous. For example, the ex-prime minister of the USA would, instead of calling people mad, would say, refer him to community care services. So the stigma of community care and mental health became intermeshed. Does it alter the nature of our discourse? Who keeps track and provides oversight? And in a society, is society asking for all this? Or it was just us professionals and the bureaucrats who were discussing all this. So to understand all this, obviously the historical process becomes important. And of course, the basic job, and since I'm a psychiatrist, is why do people go mad and how can we help them? And to understand this, one must understand that although madness has a very long history, psychiatry as a discipline is very, very young. It's barely about 200 years old. So it's the youngest branch of medicine. And medicine, as we practice it now, is based on the principles of science. And the progress over the last 400 or 500 years can explain the occurrence of almost all diseases. And we hopefully think also of psychiatry. This has become possible because of this whole process of what we call the secularization of the human mind and of the human existence. Because before that, madness of the human soul was subject to the rulers or the religions that they professed. And now we begin to explore, does the mind have matter? Is the mind created by a material process, and why does it matter? The biomedical gaze moves from ecology to the electron microscope, but the nature of the human experience remains quite obscure to us. So psychiatry is therefore an abstract branch of medicine. The human brain is confined in our skulls, but the human mind can take you to the edges of the universe and to the deepest sea and the deepest philosophical questions. So the human mind extends way beyond the human brain. And therefore, it's a very abstract notion. And therefore, psychiatry remains the most challenging, the most feared, and also the most dismissed science of psychiatry. But the reality of mental illness, oh, it's not moving at all now. Oh. Oh, okay. Okay, I got it. Okay, can you move it, please? Further. I thought I was down, down. Next. Right. So the reality of mental illness is just this, that schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, OCD, addiction, and dementia begin after life, probably several years after life. And most often people don't recover. So they have a recurrent and relapsing course, or they don't recover at all, and only few recover. And the outcomes can be pretty drastic. You can end up being tied at home on a bed, like the person above, or you can go and get the Nobel Prize, like Kurt Gödel down there. But Kurt Gödel died alone in a room in Princeton because he was too paranoid to accept food, and he starved himself to death. And the person above, although he's tied up, has a mother looking after him. So in the management of schizophrenia, what was better, the family or the Nobel Prize? These are the fundamental issues that we need to contend with when we think of illness. Of course, madness has a long history. It includes historical trends from Greek and Roman civilizations and the Indian civilization and the Islamic civilization. All of them had somewhat, can I have the next slide, please? Yeah. So it has the Greek and the Indian and the Islamic traditions, of which there are many, many medical textbooks, from Hippocrates to Charak Samhita to Bela Samhita to Rhazes. And the idea that madness arose out of humoral origins or divine origins. Is it touching? Would that be better? Okay. Thank you. So whether it was the Greek or the Indian or the Islamic philosophers, they all attributed these to human origins, but also to alcohol, to epilepsy, to seasonal relapses, to intoxicants, fear, anxiety, and the disorders of the soul, or the Rohaniyat, was the first formally made part of Islamic medicine somewhere around 880. So there was a constant exchange of ideas between the ancient worlds, and these ideas of madness were fairly common. Most religion started out with the preoccupation with medicine and psychiatry, and ideas of what is the soul, and why does illness and misery exist? Can I have the... And do all animals have a soul, and what makes a soul think and behave, and can disease be healed? And all these ideas as to what is the nature of the human psyche and the soul were a preoccupation of psychiatry and in all forms of religion from all times. So at the end of this period, the atomists could speculate that if the body had organs, did the mind have subsidiary organs? And the role of brain itself was not very clear. Till the 14th century, the soul was supposed to reside in the heart and not the brain. So psychiatry as a notion of a brain disease simply did not exist, because the brain was not known to have any serious functions. It was only in the beginning of the Middle Ages that people like Hieronymus Bosch, and at the time, went refining and letting the devil out of the person's soul by making a hole in the brain. So this becomes the first organic treatment of psychiatry, that people were making holes in people's brains, in skulls, to let out the devil. So it was a very physical understanding of madness, of the reality of the devil. But it was a social commentary also, because the doctor is wearing an inverted funnel and is actually a fool, etc., etc. But it was really the beginning of modern scientific period, basically with the work of Newton and the other scientists of that point of time. And Isaac Newton threw his hands up right at that moment. I can calculate the motion of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people. So modern science always struggled with this defining of madness. So Newton himself went through episodes of severe depression. He was exceedingly paranoid. He insisted that all traces of Robert Hooke be removed from all scientific journals, and went out of his way to extend his delusion of paranoia about Robert Hooke. So in many ways, he was quite an odd and eccentric fellow. And now we can calculate the motion of synaptic vesicles, the growth of axons in the brain. Sorry, next one. Yeah. So these kinds of ideas from Newton highlighted the problem of understanding psychiatry, because Newton raises hands up, what luck do the rest of us have? Can I have the next slide? Now, this is interesting because this is the notion of the body as it existed in the Middle Ages. On the left, you have the Vesalius classification of the nerves. In the middle, you have a textbook called the Khulasat al-Hikmat, Epitome of Medicine, written by Hakim Hamid from Dibalpur in Lahore in the reign of Shah Jahan. 28, approximately the same time. And this is the Ayurvedic man of the 18th century. So the notion of the nerves, the position of the body, the kinds of things that go on in the human body were identical in all these systems in the pre-scientific revolution era. And that is when asylums started coming up. Now, I won't bore you with the history of asylums, but asylums could be considered as an expansion of the bourgeoisie or the colonial state, as an example of the oppression of the deviant or the dispossessed, as Foucault laid out. Can I have the next slide, please? As a valid expression of humanitarian and medical concern, or the beginnings of psychiatry as we know it. The asylums, of course, were supposed to provide a retreat, providing for the tender care and recovery of a class of innocent persons suffering from the severest of afflictions to which humanity is exposed. This is Walter Ernst quoting the records of the asylums of India. And the history of asylums, which acquired these asylums as Western politics spread over the world, is what makes our work interesting. Can I have the next slide? So this was the growth of psychological ideas, which start from the Bimaristans of Spain. The building on top is the oldest, is the first Maristan of Granada, which was set up by the Islamic kingdoms and continued for many years till it was destroyed. And the bottom is the asylum at Bethlehem in London. So all these ideas of how to what do you do when you see patients? How do you develop a psychological model? How do you develop the notion of signs and symptoms? How do you understand the experience of madness? It started getting codified. Can I have the next slide? And therefore we jump straight into Madras. So this is an extract of a letter from Fort St. George on 27 March 1797 for erecting a hospital for the reception of the native poor in Madras. Now Madras had a long history of the British, the East India Company rather, set up hospitals in whichever areas it conquered. It was Calcutta or Madras. So there were asylums in Bihar in the 1770s as the army moved backwards and forwards. But Madras had a fairly settled existence. So in 1797, they started a hospital for the native poor. And within that, he starts, John Connolly puts a proposal for establishing a hospital for the insane patients. And for those who, being sensible ourselves to the salutary consequences that would result from such an establishment, this hospital is quickly established. And have the next slide. So this is from the, so that hospital was established by 1799. And the idea was that no rent should be paid to the East India Company as long as the building was devoted to public purposes. And we only later privatized this arrangement and started paying a rent of 825 rupees and then sold it to a private surgeon, James Dalton, in 1807 for 26,000 rupees, a 500-time escalation in the cost of psychiatry in 20 years, something that we are familiar with even now. Now, this Dalton then moved to Bangalore and died in Bangalore. But this kind of awareness that psychiatry was very expensive, it required a lot of arrangements, was quite evident. By the 1830s, of course, despite the British efforts, separate cooks were ordered for Brahmins and separate facilities were ordered for Brahmins because local custom would not take kindly to the idea of all patients of all castes mixing together in a mental hospital. Can I have the next hospital slide, please? So at the end of, by the middle of the 18th century, you have this very famous psychiatrist called Forbes Winslow, who's the editor of the journal Psychological Medicine. And you can read his comment. The establishment of lunatic asylums is a noble work of charity and will confer greater honor than the achievement of their proudest victories. So the setting up of hospitals became established principle of Victorian government in India. And this was accentuated when they actually ruled India in 1857, when the race prejudice becomes the most important fact of ruling a conquered country. Can I have the next slide? You have lots of doctors talking about the psychiatry in India. You have John Macpherson talking about insanity of Europeans, Ireland, and T.A. Wise, of whom I'll be talking about in a little bit more in detail, called Insanity in Bengal. And Shaughnessy, who experimented for the first time on the use of cannabis and the therapeutic uses of cannabis. Can I have the next slide? It's not just asylums. So at this point of time, mesmerism and the idea of hypnotism and the idea of communication between psyches was getting established in Europe. And James Esdale established a mesmeric hospital in Calcutta on Sukia Street. Now, this kind of the idea that human minds could communicate to each other outside that of a master slave or outside that of a priest and a supplicant was relatively new. The idea that all psychological spaces are actually communicable to each other is a very novel idea in psychiatry. And mesmerism highlighted that. So he would hypnotize the Rajas and the Babus. He popularized its use in the public, but he also noticed that the local population was peculiarly sensitive to mesmerism, as they were simple, unsophisticated children of nature. 3 Indians were employed, but of course, this hospital was shut down the moment the mutiny happened, because from that time onwards, the Indian mind and the European mind could no longer communicate to each other. They became a subject race, and there was no notion of sharing the same consciousness. So Wise noticed that the rate of insanity in India is 1/10 that of UK. It's much lower in Ceylon and in Dhaka than in England and Wales, almost 1,000 times lower. Now, T.A. Wise is not a fool. He's a Sanskrit scholar. He's written an Indian Pharmacopoeia, and he thinks that the anxieties, nervous excitement, and by the fact that Indians now have to read instead of just believing, causes the madness. They now have to think rationally. And so for a society that has never thought rationally for 2000 years, that is a sure indication for going mad. So that was his preoccupation. So therefore, he makes all these judgments. Insanity is less frequent and is milder than in England. Dhaka receives patients from as far as Assam, but nobody knows anything about them. So lots of wandering mentally ill. The climate and the mental strains of education, especially the Madhyamik exam, causes insanity. Grief of various kinds causes insanity, and heredity, of course, and alcohol. And he also predicts that in a few years, alcohol-related admission will reach 30% because alcohol use is being aggressively promoted by the British government. And his words are quite prophetic. At this point in time, NIMHANS, 1/3 of all admissions to NIMHANS are because of addiction. So it's quite true what he predicted some time ago. By the time Madras Asylum starts building its records, they know that acute mania has excellent prognosis. Insanity arises more often out of a depraved bodily condition, something that the Banyan is quite familiar with. The high rates of physical illness when patients come in. Twice as many patients come to us with physical illness as compared to Europe. And asylums should be for the harmless imbeciles and lunatics attached to Mofussil dispensaries and under medical superintendents. So this idea of having small hospitals scattered all over the state or the kingdom were introduced, and entertainment was provided by fortnightly bands from the Governor General, open house cricket twice a week for Europeans and once a week for Indians. So that's racism at its best, and the occasional circus. There was work elements too. So goods and produce sold by the patient in Madras were valued in a year at 10,000 rupees. That comes to around ₹1 million right now, approximately. Essentially, the rehab revenue by patients was enough to pay for establishment cost for 1 month of running the hospital. But that also happened because the medical superintendent in Madras was getting a salary of 800 rupees per month, equivalent to around 20 lakhs or something these days per month. Whereas the Indian subordinate surgeons of Vizag and Calicut got only rupees 50. So you can imagine the disparity between colonial rates. So work got introduced into the asylums. It was not all work play, but also some play. There was football, badminton, tennis, and baseball. The band of the governor of Madras played once every month. The patients were also amused with feats by professional jugglers and acrobats and sent on excursion trips. The motor bus was freely utilized for taking patients to fairs and festivals and surrounding places, to the Sri Krishna cinema. In Delhi, there were regular visits to all important fairs. And in the 20th century, the Hindu was provided free to all the patients. And that's a separate story. And but lots of patients develop delusions about the Hindu, but that's a separate story. So occupation therapy and the fact that can I have the next slide. You won't be able to read this, but it's basically a full detail of the Madras presidency and how people needed to be treated in terms of amusements, in terms of recreation, and how their lives could be made better. Can I have the next slide? This is around the time that the Americans were also reforming their asylums. One must remember that asylums in America started at exactly the same time as India. So psychiatry started in USA and India at exactly the same time in the end of the 18th century. If there are differences between America and India now, those are a creation of ours. So we have to understand the histories why USA and India are discrepant, because technically, the only mark of civilization in the world is the establishment of mental hospitals. And America and India started them at the same time. And this is the Wilkins report, which is quite clear. They need to be managed with fitting wisdom that few can give. And the amount of patience and forbearance cannot be found outside asylum walls, and many refuse treatment. And if they are kept at home, the family is drawn down to poverty and misery. 9/10 of the people who become ill have no means of consequence. In health, they build up some resources, and they cannot afford to send the affected member to a private asylum or in a distant part of the state, nor can they afford to keep him at home and have him properly treated. So based on this, the Wilkins reform said that we must change the nature of psychiatry. Can I have the next slide? Now, this did not produce much change in India because India continued to work under the asylum system. There were huge discrepancies. Madras Asylum had remarkably high death rates, and Burma, Eastern Bengal, and other parts had much lower death rates. Now, these kinds of local discrepancies are still reported, even in the National Human Rights Commission. Can I have the next slide? But this is also to introduce how did the ideas of asylum come about. Now, John Ruskin was a very famous British philosopher and thinker. He died in a mental hospital because of recurrent episodes of depression. When he was okay, he was a polymath, he was an artist, he was a historian, he designed various things, and he was a great proponent of the charkha, of spinning. This spinning was what he introduced to both Mahatma Gandhi and to Queen Victoria. So the idea of the charkha that we all think is a symbol of Indian independence actually comes from the ideas of a madman. One must be clear of that. This charkha spinning is John Ruskin's idea as to how to build autonomy, independence, and dignity. And this idea was formulated by him and shared with Gandhi. And his book was the first book Gandhi ever read and ever translated into Gujarati. Mahatma Gandhi's first book is a translation of Unto This Last. As you can see, the Gujarati version is right below. So people in mental hospitals have had a huge impact on society. Can I have the next one? But over these years, what did happen in reality? So this is a paper we did with my colleague, Dr. Alok Srin, some years ago. The number of mentally ill were counted in 1871 in the first census. They fall sharply in 1881 because they fall by almost 40% because of the great famines of Madras and Mysore of 1879. So almost a third of the patients die. By 1891, they fall even further because the famines continued and they extend to Middle India, to Central India. And the number of mentally ill declines for 20, 30 years till about 1911 because the poverty and the grinding famines of India under colonial rule, the disadvantaged and the disabled have to pay a very heavy price. So almost 1/3 of the people die in the influenza, for example. So you can see proportionately the amount of mentally ill keep on becoming further down. Can I have the next slide? So that little rectangle points to the slide, points to the area where the famine occurred. And that's a picture of the people in Bangalore, emaciated, huddling in front of probably the Raj Bhavan now, but then the governor's residence. And the decrease in the insane was almost half the mentally ill people died in those areas which are affected by famine. And only the general population declined by only 10%. So the lack of institutional services, the lack of concern for the marginalized was a part of our experience under colonial rule. Can I have the next? And the census after census logged them in as unproductive occupation. Why have I put this slide? Because these were the people who were counted in the asylum reports till 1941. And Dr. Desiraju once pointed out to us after one of these discussions, he says, it's all very nice for you to be so concerned and so passionate about all this. But when I go to the finance ministry, they say, you actually want us to create expenses for people who are unproductive, who will never pay taxes, who cannot pay taxes. Why would we do this? So this idea of listing people with mentally ill purely in terms of productive capacity is again a residue of the administration of the early colonial period, or the mid-colonial period. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, but it wasn't so bad on the personal level. Lodge Patch was a third-generation Scots medical doctor who worked in the First World War, who fought in the First World War. He opts for the psychiatric service, then called the alienist service. And he points out very important criticisms of, he said the joint family system actually is a burden. That the whole family. And the number of mentally, even in the census, are underreported by 1,000%, something we were discussing earlier this afternoon. The census of 1921 records only 100,000 people mentally ill for the whole of India, whereas Lodge Patch expects this to be 4.5 million. The fate of the mentally ill is pretty bad. They are often pitiful vagrants, indescribably dirty, miserably emaciated, naked. If they are women, they are violated by any chance passerby. So this was the reality of life on the street for the mentally ill. And even his medical colleagues pointed out would often not come to treatment because behavior like this, even when a woman is banging her head around the floor, even the psychiatrist will do something. So she was brought to him. Can I have the next slide? And he was very interesting comment he makes. It is indeed something that the British Empire, which I have served in times unworthily and times insubordinately, but always with pride, could hand down to Pakistan with equal pride in the hope and the injunction that Pakistan should treat her insane as considerately as it always tried to treat them. Now, this treatment of the insane suffered hugely under the partition, and we've written a book on that, but I won't go into that. And of course, many of you would have heard of Prabhat Singh. Can I have the next slide? The other maverick person was Owen Berkeley Hill, who was from, I think, Rugby and Oxford. And his grandfather was something changed. Was a very famous Victorian reformer. He himself went native and married an Indian lady, and that too from Kerala, of a non-upper caste. So he was turned out of British society, but he wrote these very interesting essays on the psychology of the Sari, on the psychology of the Germans, the psychology of the anus, and the mental process in the sane and the insane. Now, in all this, he tried to interact or understand Indian behavior. For example, his urge, his psychological treatment of the communal problem was to simply invite everybody to a common meal. And whether he was helped along in that by his wife, who was from Kerala, from a non-upper caste. And the reform movements in Kerala did make a whole effort in making people eat together. So his ideas about how to change Indian society were therefore very interactive and politically astute in that sense. He was, of course, a maverick and did all kinds of funny things, including develop a kind of a Freudian theory of how the Indian mind worked. Can I have the next slide? So asylums in India, therefore, one can see the asylums start, for example, in Tezpur, the furthermost part of the Indian Empire in 1876. This occurs about 5 years before the first asylums, around the same time as the first asylums are opened in California. So you can see the asylums start out from England and they end up encircling the globe from Tezpur to California. China and Japan don't have asylums at that point of time. But as Bengal was partitioned, Tezpur and Dhaka were merged and then separated. In 1918, Dhaka was shut and patients moved all the way to Ranchi. In 1947, non-Indian patients from Tezpur were moved to Pakistan, which did not have an asylum at that point of time. And from Ranchi, lots of Muslim patients were also moved out. The asylums of Delhi were moved several times. A big asylum was started, a small asylum was started. Then it was shifted to Bareilly as Delhi was still Mughal, and Bareilly and Awadh had been taken over by the British. The Delhi asylum was ransacked as the first part of the mutiny, and then again re-established, and then all kinds of movements were done, basically because asylums and hospitals were a stamp of colonial rule. And of course, in 1947, lots of patients were transferred back and forth. Can I have the next slide? Yeah. But all this is happening at the asylum end. In the real world, in the other world of medical treatment, Gananath Sen and Karthik Chandra Bose discovered the first ever drug treatment for psychiatry. The roots of the recipe plant, which can control both hypertension and in mental disorders of maniacal type, become the first ever treatments in the world of psychiatric illness, and also the first treatments of hypertension. But Gananath Sen is an Ayurvedic physician from a family of Ayurvedic practitioners, and K.C. Bose is a modern medical doctor. They are accompanied in all this work by Salam-uz-Zaman Siddiqui, whose brother is part of the Constituent Assembly, and R. Hussain, who try to understand the chemistry of all this. Can I have the next slide? And Salim-uz-Zaman Siddiqui is a very interesting person. He's educated in Santiniketan, Aligarh, London, Berlin. He's a faculty at Aligarh and Delhi. He starts the central CSIR of India and then of Pakistan. He extracts lots of medicines from the raw wolfia plants and from neem plants. And he's a very accomplished physicist, chemist. He becomes a member of the Royal Society, translates Ghalib and Mir into Urdu, from Rilke into Urdu, and wants to become a painter, but ends up becoming a scientist. Now, this kind of intense work that could be done between Calcutta, Delhi, Bangalore, and simply did not occur after independence because all these skills were lost. Can I have the next slide? And in the middle of all this, the Royal Indian Medico-Psychological Association was set up in 1939 in Lahore. It was the first association of professional mental health professionals outside of the UK. One must remember that till we became independent, all training had to occur in London. And not just for India, for Australia, Canada, New Zealand, everybody had to go back to London. But this was the first association outside of the UK, and lots of doctors between the two wars, like Gunji Boy, Lal Kaka, Banarsi Das from here, FSC Narona from Bangalore, Govind Swami, about 40 or 50 psychiatrists from all over India were sent to London to train. And they were expected to provide leadership to the rest of the empire, to the whole of the British Empire, because India had the largest middle class, educated middle class in the whole of the empire. But all these things were dispersed during the war. Can we have the next slide? And that coincided with the migration of the Jewish doctors. So Willy Mayer Gross was the youngest ever professor of psychiatry at Heidelberg, a Jew, got migrated to London with help from the Rockefeller grant, where he met Dr. Govind Swami, who had gone there on the imperial grants to study psychiatry. The two became thick friends, and Mayer Gross's ideas of organic psychiatry and phenomenology and various other kinds of German philosophical viewpoints about psychiatry became the standard text for psychiatry in Bangalore, which was then being established after independence as the training center for psychiatry for east of the Suez, and not just India. So all this merging of European ideas about psychiatry, not British ideas of psychiatry, guided development in India. And the first batch of students that Mayer Gross interacted with included Professor Sarda Menon, and therefore she incorporated many of these ideas into her work. The next slide. Now, Govind Swami was a very interesting person because he was a Brahmin, a very devout Brahmin. And, but he was very skeptical about the way philosophy and Ayurveda could be enmeshed. Historical anthropological developments have been evolutionary rather than revolutionary, and they can be no marked cultural determinant of mental health, because mental illness occurs in all cultures. If they were so different, then we should have different rates of mental illness. He felt that a belief in God, a personal philosophy of life, an organized unitary family system, and early marriage, note the early marriage, was an effective security against mental breakdown. Freud's followers in India have exploited gullible population, and Freud is an excessive strain on one's credulity. And positive mental health includes discriminative self-restraint and consideration for others. And psychotherapies, if divested of the spiritual and mystic investments, could be useful. And of course, he was very fond of leucotomies and insulin comas. And his favorite treatment for people being brought in with emaciation was actually, despite his Brahminism, beef stock. Beef soup was a standard treatment for everybody, for all mentally people being brought into the hospital, because that's the best cure for getting rid of their emaciation. So in many ways, it was quite revolutionary. At the same point of time, we had, can I have the next slide? We had the other issue of the partition going on. And this was a meeting in August of 1947 to discuss psychological issues following communal violence and the present conflicts and those in prospect, which contain within them the possibility of human and cultural destruction. To divide people up by religion, by caste, is cultural destruction. And there are many issues discussed, including, for example, by Professor Sastry from ISC Bangalore, who felt that the whole Indian society had an unresolved Oedipus complex, had an inferiority complex or unconscious fear of the other, and that in any case, there was too much romanticism about the goodness of human beings, and human beings could actually be inherently evil, which was quite in evidence. So these kinds of discussions, which is what are the psychological issues that independent India will have to contend with, were being discussed. Can I have the next slide? And these kinds of partitions have gone on. As I just mentioned, within India, what has happened to the asylums is therefore not very clear. When we merged Maharashtra, when we divided Maharashtra up, Telugu speaking patients were shifted from Nasik to Hyderabad. This whole hospital was shut down and there's no record of it now. Hyderabad is also downsized. Dharwad was moved from Maharashtra to Karnataka, from Bombay Presidency to Karnataka. Vizag was moved from Madras Presidency to Andhra Pradesh. And patients were again transferred depending on what language they spoke. What happened to the patients, etc., we have no idea. Can I have the next slide? So here comes a person called D. Satyanand, who vaguely calls himself Dev Satyanand, David Satyanand, D.S. Nand, etc., etc. He's a medical doctor. He's a lieutenant colonel in the army. He starts using Freudian ideas. And by the time he writes about all these things, he is also fluent with Persian, Urdu, Hindi, Punjabi, English, and to some extent German. And he therefore makes these very interesting comments that Shankara and Radhakrishnan, Hegel and Russell are much the same. And since we are talking about Desiraju, I thought we'd bring in Radhakrishnan in any case. But by the 1950s, soon after independence, when he's appointed as professor of the first professor of the All India Institute of Medical Sciences in Delhi, he's a founding psychiatric professor there. And he makes this very stark comment, as you can read. The prevailing political socio-economic state of the country is caused by defective and immature community ego development, and the low state of political, social, and economic integration causes and maintains defective and immature community egos, something that we are politically quite aware of. So he suggests all these things, that we should have community mental health, you should have a registry of cases, you should do preventive psychiatry in schools, families, and addiction. The fragmentation of care should be avoided so that patients can seek treatment continuously at whatever level they want. So this was all well established by the early 1950s, and how to promote a sense of belongingness, which is most essential for civic happiness. Can I have the next slide? And he was not alone. This is a document prepared by Professor K.K. Masani, then the director of AIMH Bangalore. He's the younger brother of Meenu Masani, the politician. And his first preoccupation is to change the legal procedure for psychotic patients. Exactly what Keshav Desiraju tried to do a few years ago. So the idea was there way back in 1959. We have to change the legal procedure. We have to facilitate entry into mental hospitals or licensed nursing homes for treatment. And this is a 20-page document. And almost every notion of community psychiatry that we have developed consequently derives from the work of K.K. Masani, without acknowledging K.K. Masani. Because K.K. Masani was a friend of John Bowlby, who worked on depression, and he got so sick and tired of trying to bang his head against this impermeable wall of Indian bureaucracy that he moved to England and never came back to India. Can I have the next slide? And this was only for the next decade. Now, how did we manage all this asylums? Not very well. So the joke has always been that although we make fun of the white man's burden, the transferring of the white man's burden to brown shoulders was not reasonably effective. So we can see what happened when the Rangoon asylum was lost to the Japanese in 1943 when they invaded Asia. The doctor was asked to release them because they would be a danger. He was so upset that by that time it was an Indian doctor that he committed suicide. He shot himself at the sheer trauma of putting patients out into the world because he had protected them. And they all marched towards the Japanese, who cut them all down with their swords. So most of them were killed. What happened in Tezpur in 1962? When the Chinese advanced, the entire Indian state abdicated. But this time the psychiatrist did not abdicate. He released the patients, but he looked after them and he made sure that they were well. And for that, he got a Padma Shri. So over these 20 or 30 years, you see there's a difference in the way psychiatrists themselves respond to the political events around. Can I have the next slide? So from the beginnings in the first half of the previous millennium, asylums expanded to Americas, Asia, Africa, and Australia in the last quarter of the last millennium, between 1752, in the first 100 years, 1750 to 1850. This was the first formal attempt by human society to build and provide a systemic societal response to insanity of a secular nature. These asylums were not based on religion, were not housed in churches or mosques or temples. This is the first modern attempt to a modern understanding of psychiatry. This was also characterized by the development of modern medicine And these ideas of what to do were constantly modified and transformed because this medicine and dissection and all the various things that we do in medicine came up. One must remember that almost everything that we use now, right from inoculations to vaccination to the microscope to the stethoscope, were all created in this period of 1820 to 1920. And as the political movements came up, the psychiatry itself became infused with colonialism, fascism, nationalism, Marxism, and other factors. And that's a separate political history. But equally by the pharmacology, neuroscience, genetics, and other technoscientific advances. Can I have the next slide? So what we can see is an intersect in the practice of psychiatry in UK, Europe, and India, and thinking about mental health over the last 3 centuries. It moved gradually from asylum-based psychiatry to public health psychiatry over 150 years in India, from 1800 to about 1950. And although initially introduced by the East India Company, it gradually became part of the imperial machinery. Under the absence of any public or civil engagement, the reforms were very slow. Because the colonial government did not need to respond to democratic concerns, need not have responded to public concerns. There was no feedback to the colonial government or their participation. So reforms are exceedingly slow. Individual doctors like Lodge Patch and Berkeley Hill and others, and social reformers, and even the rulers, for example, the rulers of Travancore on whom we are working, or the rulers of the Punjab Kingdom or Cooch Behar and Hyderabad, and did invest a lot in mental health care. But these were all individual efforts. But because they had created this network, they did recognize the lacunae and made significant contributions to improve things. And they set the stage for the rapid extension in the post-independence period. Now, what do we do then? How do we understand that? The All India Institute of Mental Health, which is now NIMHANS, was established in 1955 to aid research and training postgraduate teachers because all the doctors in India could no longer teach English. That was made very clear as part of the independence. But within NIMHANS itself, between the AIMH itself, there was a constant tension between the biomedically oriented doctors like Govind Swami and Murthy Rao and the more social responsive people like Masani, Surya, and Satyanand, who had a very different notion of psychiatry as multiplicity of factors, social understandings, etc. Attempts at reforms were attempted 1950s onwards, and social psychiatry and community psychiatry became popular from the 60s. And that happened also because the first wave of psychiatrists from India, post-independence, were there to see deinstitutionalization firsthand, whether you talk of N.N. Vig in Chandigarh or Sarda Menon in Chennai, or Ajita Chakravarti in Calcutta, or B.V. Sethi and J.S. Neki in Northern India. They all had experience in working in England in the 60s, trying to shift patients from asylums to the community. And therefore they adapted institutionalization, community care models, general hospital psychiatry units, and therapy models of community care. Essentially became a component of a primary health center bureaucracy. At this time, in the 50s, we had less than 100 certified psychiatrists in the whole of India. So they could sit on their ivory towers and their whatever positions of power and decide all this. Now, what do we have now? Over the next 20 years, 30 years, we now have an excess of psychiatrists. We are training 1,000 psychiatrists every year, which is way beyond what anybody in the world would need. The total number of beds and facilities for psychiatry stagnated 30,000 from the time of independence till now. There's no increase in services by the government, and the private sector is regulated. So 30,000 beds is all we have. And the lack of investment in services within the models of medical care leads to a migration of many, many doctors. So there are more than 6,000 psychiatrists from India working in the UK, the USA, Canada, North America, and Australia and New Zealand. There's been a massive exodus of psychiatrists. These services are necessarily thin and they lack depth and because they have very inadequate engagement with biology, because psychiatry is still the Cinderella. We can get MRI machines, but the MRI machine will be used only for neurology patients. You can have very expensive EEG, but that has to be understood by a neurologist. You can have autoimmune workups, but only a virologist will do that. The psychiatrist will not ask for all these tests, whereas we know that a large proportion of those who are mentally ill actually have viral infections, malnutritions, brain infections, etc. So biology, even the fundamental biology of medical care of psychiatric patients is very limited. And the psychosocial is even worse because of the way our universities are constructed. Medical students start cramming for medicine from the time they are in 10th, and they never enter a formal university. They go to medical apprenticeships or training schools. They don't learn any liberal arts at all. So they have no notion of psychology, sociology, anthropology, ethics, etc., etc. So the dissociation is both ways. The humanities never learn about the sciences, and the sciences don't learn about the humanities. And this dissonance plays havoc in the real life of the patients, because you start fractionating care all the time. This thing will be done by somebody else, this will be done by somebody else, and this will be done by somebody else. The patient is just the one person. The body is difficult to divide the body up. Imagine trying to divide minds up. So it's really very quite a tragic situation. In all these ideas over the last post-independence care, responsibility for the long-term care of mental ill has never been articulated. The issue has been to reduce costs, to reduce bed stay, to reduce basically costs, to hand over the land of the mental hospitals to private. The Amritsar Mental Hospital now has a Taj Hotel in it. Vizag Hospital also has a Taj Hotel inside the campus. The campus is being sold to them. Pune Hospital has luxury flats in part of the gardens. So the lands of the mental hospitals, which are for patients, are now real estate property. And even in IMH, I believe lots of it is being transferred to a separate kind of institution. Delhi has been transferred to a separate institution. So all these facilities of the mentally ill there's no planning at all. And this unconcern and the preoccupation with defining ours and theirs as to who needs treatment. Is the BPL card of this state or that state? Is this patient to be sent home to his own state or to be kept anywhere in India? No, these are things that occupy us. Intense amount of bureaucratic effort is spent on defining us and them, which is completely pointless. So even when and this is basically the colonial mentality. So all these asylums retain that that idea, because the Indian Medical Service was the only service that was disbanded after independence. The Foreign Service, the Army, the Police, the Judicial Service, the ICS, the intelligence were all retained. The Indian Medical Service is the only Indian medical service which was specifically disbanded, so that there can be no idea of a universal Indian medical problem. It was a very specific cutting off your nose to spite your face. Because if Indian Medical Service had existed, these problems could have had a universal understanding. We could have developed an idea of universal healthcare, but now we're reduced to finding Tamil healthcare, Kerala healthcare, North Kerala healthcare, South Mysore region healthcare, North Karnataka healthcare. We don't have a universal healthcare. So there is no attempt. And the politics of nationalism and parochialisms and patients need to be looked after by their own community. Who defines that own community is never decided. Does it include the doctor? Does it include the nurse? Does it include the family? Who is this own community that we are talking about? And I won't quote Ambedkar here as to the parochialisms of that. And therefore, it creates problems when the disabled and the mentally ill fall between these cracks of that we have created in psychiatry. Can I have the next slide? The true solution, of course, would be, can I have the next slide? Oh, sorry, the previous one. This is a problem. Next. Yeah. The true solution, of course, to all this, as Roy Porter, the historian, pointed out, is the public acceptance without shame of mental disorder, but that would be crying for the moon. So what did we understand over the last 200 or 300 years? We know that we robbed madness of its power to be seers and prophets and saints. We assumed that the people who had, and when insanity spoke, whether it's Mirabai or Joan of Arc or Akka Mahadevi, society listened. But over now, it just becomes somebody you prescribe risperidone to. They're no longer prophetics. They're no longer prophets. And once institutionalized and medicalized, madness was robbed of all such allure, dignity, and truth, and reduced from a positive state of divinity to an utterly negative condition of unreason. And this led to a massive fall in the status of the mentally ill in society. Can I have the next slide? On the other hand, as K. Jameson pointed out, and K. Jameson is a very famous psychiatrist. She wrote the textbook of manic depressive insanity, and also many autobiographical books about her own experience with mental illness. And she described facilities where one could be both mad and safe at the same time as being the essential requirement for psychiatric care. And asylums for the insane, which started with high intentions, usually ended in horror and neglect, as we all know in the last part of the 20th century. But one must remember that society's ideals deteriorate more rapidly than the structures built to facilitate them. And just like the ideas of democracy, universal education, human rights, emancipation are all 19th century ideas. They all, and if we want to continue with these 19th century ideas, perhaps care of the mentally ill should also fall in the same bracket of something that is to be strived for and not just forgotten in the dust as a dustbin of history. Can I have the next slide? I think that would be the end of it. Can I have the next slide? Yeah, no, sorry, previous one. So thank you very much for your attention. The work has been made possible by a generous grant from the Wellcome Trust and my colleagues, Pratima, Alok, Radhika, Nadia, Sara, Pradipto. And so it's been a interesting journey. Can I have the next one? And this is something completely different, but I just want to leave you with this slide. So this is the famous Solvay conference, which decided the nature of relativity theory and modern quantum physics way back in 1927. Of the names, and if you can read them, there are some which are marked in red. The ones marked in red are those people who have already developed a psychotic illness or have an offspring or a sibling with mental illness. So technically, they are all carrying the genetics of mental illness. It is based on the work of Heisenberg, Wolfgang Pauli, Bragg, father and son, Marie Curie, Albert Einstein, that we use our cell phones and use these mics. They're quite unreliable and uncertain, but that's how it is. Dirac is also there. So the fact that the mad will always be with us. That is a fact of life. All of us will carry thousands of genes that can provoke or precipitate a mental illness. There is no world without madness conceivable, at least in human society. It may be possible in some animal societies, which is, we don't know enough. We can't communicate with them very well. But there is no human society which can divest itself of madness. So the need to care for the mentally ill is going to be a constant. You cannot erase this. You cannot defeat this. You cannot wipe them out. The Nazis tried that and didn't go very well. So the fact that the mentally ill is the other way. Spike Milligan, the excellent British writer, had this comment: blessed are the cracked because they let in the light. So that is also the counterpoise, that the mentally ill have to be looked after because they are the only ones who can offer you insights which would otherwise not have. Because that is why psychiatry remains the most obscure, challenging. It's understanding the nature of madness, which is the greatest, which would be the greatest intellectual challenge of the next 100 years. And that is why it needs the people who are living this life of madness need to be appreciated for the torments that they are undergoing, so that the rest of us can understand what can happen to our minds. Without that understanding, we are just shadow human beings. So it's very, very important that we understand this role of psychiatry as much as we understand the need to look after the mentally ill. Thank you very much for your attention. Oh, just shutting this down.
you for your talk. It's a fascinating talk. I must say, perhaps one of the finest talks I have listened to in a long time. Thank you for that. So, a couple of questions. One is, you mentioned this thing about India producing 1,000 psychiatrists. Yeah, which is obviously great. Population, we're still sort of struggling for population to sort of match, the needs. So any, thoughts on perhaps whether that could be scaled up or you think that's appropriate at this point? The second is, I'm not sure about the geographic distribution of psychiatrists in general across countries, large countries like India. A lot of them congregate in the cities, where, and the rural areas are left out. So I don't know how it is for India. And the final point is about the humanities, the sciences. I think that's a point that's obviously, we understand well. Is there a reason you think why that combination hasn't sort of worked out in medical sciences?
So I'll go backwards. The Indian society has always had a problem with modernity. And I'll be deliberately provocative here. We want the latest American cars and the latest internets and the latest, if we break a hip, the steel has to come from Finland. And we have a heart problem, the stents must come from Germany. But when it comes to psychology, we must do only Indian psychology. We are not willing to have a modern secular understanding of the human mind. We prefer to think ourselves in terms of a Muslim mind and a Hindu mind and a caste mind and this mind and that mind. As you can see in any political, psychology kind of tradition, wherever the Nikayat would go, as if it's one vote. It's so nobody asks us, thankfully, how will a Nikayat madman do?
It's not very far. That's why this notion of every community having its own mind and have its own definitions of madness becomes dangerous. So in India, this whole approach of humanities teaching is even more troublesome. We may produce 1,000 psychiatrists a year, but we produce less than 200 psychologists a year. Because the field of psychology itself is not popular in the academic space. For a long time, we couldn't start teaching psychology because Calcutta and Madras University insisted that psychology is a part of philosophy, and that too German philosophy. And very few young independent Indians wanted to spend time reading Heidegger. So the first psychologist, Nimhan, started the psychology department mainly because Mysore Kingdom had sent psychologists to America to train. And the initial faculty was American trained in general psychology and not in existentialist or psychodynamic psychiatry. So this confusion as to what Indian psychology is creates a problem, because not many liberal institutions would like to venture into that, to develop an Indian psychology which is aware of the stresses and strains of what happens to people here with us. For example, I can give you clinical examples. Patients come to us because of caste discrimination, poverty, houses get burnt, children get killed in a communal riot. We have nothing in the textbooks of psychology or sociology that we teach which will answer that need. So we haven't produced that academic discipline which answers our local realities of how modern India is changing and evolving. So this discrepancy becomes quite apparent. Now, when you take it to medicine, we have reduced medicine into a purely operational process. And my colleagues in USA will point out that when Indian doctors go there, they say they are perfectly competent as practitioner nurses. They know how to diagnose, they know how to treat. But why the disease occurred and why this treatment is being given, they don't want to talk about that. So the questioning of medical dicta. So most medical exams are governed by rote learning, by learning lists, diagnostic criteria. If this happens, give this, algorithms that if this symptom doesn't improve in 4 weeks, do this. Why are we doing this? Why are we following this? We don't know. But this is the way we have to do. So that thinking, the lack of critical thinking in both the technical part and the social science part creates a problem. So that's one aspect. The 1,000 psychiatrists a year is as per my colleagues who are part of the IPS postgraduate training, and they tell me that 1,000 seats have been sanctioned for psychiatry. of which only around 200 are in the public sector, the rest are private sector. Now, when you're paying so much money to become a psychiatrist, the idea that you'll go to a village is completely remote. So once you privatize education itself, then you can't have a public service, because services will follow where the money is. The money is in the urban areas. And we have had no intention of developing a public health system, because in percentage amounts, we are spending less now than the British spent when they were ruling us. Health spending is lesser now than it was under the British. So there is no notion of a public health service. There is no notion of a universal health care. Of course, they are concentrated, but producing a large number of psychiatrists who all repeat DSM-5, ICD-10, receptor blockage of this and that from the latest fashion is of no consequence unless you understand what the plight of a poor on the street person with schizophrenia who's not allowed, who, for example, in Pakistan get killed because he, in his mania, he talks about the Prophet and he can actually get killed. It can happen in India too. It has happened in India too. So people just don't understand the difference between this madness of what medical psychiatry defines as madness and the other social madnesses that go on around us of various kinds. So those margins are not drawn. We still think wo to pagal hai is a compliment sometimes and as a derogatory statement sometimes. And everybody is confused about this. So psychiatry has to answer the qualitative aspects as much as the quantitative aspects. Sorry, it's a very long answer, but since you had 3 questions, I took the liberty. Sorry.
Indian medical service. Don't you think events like this, people like you and everyone now, I mean, all of them can start and act as a catalyst to redefine or redesign or rejig whatever, to bring it again, so that it will be able to address not only the your mental illness, of course, a whole lot of things related to the medical.
Thank you very much. And this was a specific thing that we did discuss with Mr. Desiraju several times.
Because he was as much appalled by this fractionated kind of service. But apparently this was something that was started after 1857 as a kind of devolution for local government. And health became part of local government as the first reforms in 1880. And nobody has had the guts to say the world has changed. If the whole of Europe can have a universal healthcare and can think of these things beyond local healthcare, perhaps we should change. Somebody will need to bell the cat, because I think even 2 years ago, there was a big article in the newspapers that the government is contemplating bringing back Indian medical service. Now, this got nothing to do with the answer, but I can tell you from my own personal experience. When I graduated, I got a registration for Medical Council of India. The Medical Council of India has since disbanded, and I can only become practitioner of Karnataka or one state at a time. Doctors cannot move. They have physically immobilized them. So it's more difficult to move from Bangalore to Delhi than it is to move from Bangalore to Sydney or London because of our rules. So our governments have specifically made sure that doctors are not part of a universal workforce. And that's why they prefer to go abroad. Because you can't, you'll know from your own experience, how many Punjabi doctors will you have in the private sector in Chennai? Very few, very few. Specialist services is different, surgeons and things, but actually run-of-the-mill neighborhood doctors. And this was a common thing in Lahore. When the partition happened, there were so many Tamilian doctors. There was a whole series of Tamil students who volunteered to help in the partition efforts. including Dr. Padmavati, who became the famous cardiologist of Delhi. So there were enough Tamil students of medicine and practitioners in Lahore to do this. That does not occur anymore. So I would like to see an Indian medical service come back, but if it's going to be the same bureaucracy as the Forest Service and the IAS, perhaps it's not a good idea, but never know.
On the role of families, is there a duty of care up to a certain extent, as long as they can handle it? And in your experience, how do Indian families behave in this respect? You're both based on your direct experience and what you've read.
So, the Indian family has been the favorite workhorse of almost all care services in India. Actually, anybody who gets admitted to a hospital has to have a family member, because otherwise you're not sure whether your food is being delivered, whether your bottom is being wiped, whether your pillows are being changed. So everybody, whether it's an orthopedics or eye surgery, a family member has to be there. So family members obviously play a critical role, because we do not have the systems by which a person can be treated entirely on their own. At Nimhans, we had something called a family therapy unit when we joined. It's recently been demolished physically as a building. But the idea there was that Nimhans had the opposite idea. They felt a lot of pathology in individuals is actually arising out of family interactions. And unless you treated family interactions, patients could not improve. The family as a cause for mental illness was also a factor. But the fact of the matter is that most care is provided by the families. We do not have the vast numbers. As you go to any city in USA, you'll find tens of thousands of people wandering the streets, because after the age of 25, the families cannot look after them. They are not covered by insurance. They can't pay for the psychiatrist. Psychiatrist care is $200 a visit. Antipsychotics are $500 a month. Most Americans can't afford that. So they end up on the street. So the family here provides that buffer. Somehow treatment is given. Somehow they are kept clean. Somehow they are given a place of dignity and respect in their home. Somehow people adjust around them. And that lack of exclusion of people who are mentally ill goes a very, very long way in improving quality of life, because it really makes a huge difference. The problem is that as per the National Mental Health Survey, the average family size is now down to 4 in households. And the costs of living are getting higher. So to look after a person who's not economically productive becomes a real trauma. And if there are 2 parents and both are working and a child becomes ill and they have another child to look after, who will look after this patient in the hospital? The hospital simply refuses to admit them. So they have to take time off from work. So the notion of a family being present all the time will need serious rethinking. There was a very famous British psychiatrist called Eve Johnston who once gave a talk at Nimhans. And a student asked her, what has been your biggest accomplishment? She was a community psychiatrist, had worked in community psychiatry and become president of the Royal College and all that. She said, my biggest victory is that when I joined as a student, parents would say, who will look after my child after me? And I can proudly say, at least in Scotland, that nobody need ask that question anymore. Nobody asks us anymore, what will happen to my child or my brother after me? We have created a system by which people will be looked after. So the reliance on the family and the non-investment in public services will create a crisis in the years to come. As parents die, as siblings leave, as they migrate, who will look after the mentally ill? You know, I remember a particular person who was very interesting. Without being religious, she was a Christian lady. She had 7 children. One of them was mentally ill. All of them had migrated. But this lady would not leave because she felt she had to look after her child. Other children would keep saying, just put him in a hospital and come away with us to Australia, Canada, America, wherever. She said, no. And we tried to help her to the extent possible, and that created its own. So at the end of it, she asked Dr. Ajit Bhide, a good friend and mine, and she called us home. And she said, "Doctor, you're so concerned about the welfare of others. How can you not be a Christian?" So we had to answer that question. Please become a Christian, because then at least I understand why you are so concerned about others. But that's a separate story. But so this kind of commitment that families have to make, the sacrifices they have to make, the extent to which they have to go. Now, she was in her 70s, looking after a mentally ill child who was in his 40s, devoid of any support, emotional support from anybody else. All her relatives had moved away. But there she is, stuck with looking, and she does not know what will happen to him once she is gone. Because there'll be no family at all for this young man who's 40. There'll be no siblings, nobody. And we haven't created a system to look after those.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
I think you drew our attention to both biology and the humanities and why they are all important in mental health care. I practice integrative health. So my patients have options like Ayurveda, yoga, brain stimulation, and psychopharmacology under one roof apart from psychotherapy. Do you think we should harness our very strong and rich tradition of Ayurveda? You talked about Raulpia Serpentina, not just for internal medicine, but as a biopsychosocial model of care. We have Ayurveda, we have yoga, you have Unani, we have Siddha, we have homeopathy, which is a European tradition for practice in India. We have naturopathy, another European tradition practice in India. And of course, there is room for spiritual traditions that bring people to care, because one of the reasons that people don't access care is because they don't completely understand why they should take a medicine. So do you think we need to broaden our thought process and integrate our efforts better to provide better public mental health?
So that's a loaded question. So, so it will have a kind of complex
Answer. But it's also the fact that actually in medicine, we have narrowed our minds down. The field of medicine hasn't narrowed its gaze. To take a simple example of succinylcholine, which is used by all doctors to relax the body. From the discovery of the curare, which is used as a tip of the root, tip of the arrow to kill animals in South America, to making succinylcholine, took a mere 250 years. To understand the chemistry, to understand the manufacturing, to understand everything else. This was ancient herbal medicine, as far as the South American natives are concerned. To convert into modern medicine took 200 years. Okay. Now, whether there are many such drugs available in the pharmacopoeias and the knowledge systems, which could actually be useful, we have no idea. The problem is the Americans have patented every herbal extract. They have patented every known plant of India and use that in mouse models, rat models, cell culture models, brain cell models, and they know a lot of the biology of these drugs. Unless we, as a broader framework of scientists and clinicians, don't get interested in understanding the ethnopharmacology or ethnobiology of our country, we will always become part of this marketing strategy that we need to rediscover our roots. All drugs used in psychiatry, cardiology, and neurology are plant-based drugs. We haven't invented a single new molecule in the history of mankind. Okay. So everything that we do is actually integrative medicine. There is no non-integrated medicine. Electric stimuli were used by the Greeks with electric eels. They were used by the early people who developed whatever condensers and static electricity. The fact that electricity could modulate behavior is known for about 250 years. We still don't know how it works, but we still use it. So the idea that there are partitions between one scheme of thinking and the other is a creation of our own minds. we do need to understand this. Now, the spirituality is something where that is something that I would draw at least a faint line at. Because the way spirituality is understood now, in the current social climate, the spirituality of different religions may have very different meanings. And that may prevent a uniform acceptance. And that would be antithetical to the notion of modern medicine. If I had to taper my therapy, depending on the religion of the person and my religion, it would be very, very difficult. So that is where I personally would find a problem, because I am not educated in all the religions of the world. So how do I address that? So that is a problem. And that's about it, because I don't understand the spiritual aspects of it at all. It's not taught in my books. I don't experience it. I can't palpate it. I can't measure it. So as a doctor, I'm a mechanic. So, yes.
So Sanjeev, I have a question. You mentioned that psychiatry, as all of us know, is a relatively new science. To what extent do you think it's an exact science? Question one. Question two, to what extent do you think it's influenced by the social order of the day, norms and mores of a particular era, considering that homosexuality featured in DSM-3 and doesn't today? So how much of what we see today are we going to not see in the years to come?
See, exactness in science is a pigment. So Heisenberg's
Uncertainty principles tells you that you can't be certain about any measurement, whether in physics or chemistry or psychology. So measurement or exactitude is not all it claims to be. We have approximations. We have an approximate notion of reality. You have an approximate notion of how the world works, but we don't have an exact notion of how the world is created and why it works. But we are perfectly willing to drive a car in this approximate reality that physics creates and live in it. Why do we insist on complete certainty in the mental space when we're not even sure of it in the physical space? So that's an abstract answer. Now, the DSM-5 and the homosexuality thing is slightly fashionable, tilting and windmills. You must remember that, I'm sure you don't remember because these are all odd papers that one reads. But one of the causes for insanity in American mental hospitals was Catholicism. Being a Catholic was enough to drive you mad. Cigarette smoking, masturbation, popeism, clairvoyance, tea drinking, too much tea. So over times, the psychiatrists were trying to make an approximate, and this was a time when Indian psychiatry had only 5 causes of illness: morality, grief, addiction, genetic, or stress. So Indian psychiatrists or psychiatrists in India had only 5 causes of insanity. The Americans had 100 causes of insanity. The Americans have been weird. Okay, so let's accept that. But the fact that Catholic faith got moved out of a cause of insanity by 1910 is as important as homosexuality moving out in 2000. It was because of a particular kind of questioning about the nature of diagnosis and observations themselves that this happened. I don't think politics or fashion of the day had anything to do with it. Just like negritude, the idea that all slaves who ran away had a mental illness, disappeared after a point of time when the African-American population was given civil rights. But those are, in the wide scheme of psychiatry, they are blips. Because after all, doctors are not in an absolute ivory tower or a pedestal. They are reacting to changes in the community. And any statistical knowledge of classification will say that people who are very tall are different from the others who are averagely tall. That works for sexuality as much as it does for height and weight and body and size. So if you take notions of averages, then people with sexuality become different. Are you going to play primacy to the human will and not to the body? That's up to you. So these are fashionable terms. They don't really mean anything. It doesn't take away from the fact that lots of people still hear voices telling them that they're turning gay and they're actually schizophrenic. It doesn't take away from the fact that patients with schizophrenia sometimes cut off the genitalia because they want to become like a woman because of God, because voices tell them that they actually have to do this. You still get those. So there is no one answer to this question.
I think, just to follow up, considering that many of the that remains somewhat the same. So
Question is more around, let's say, for example, depression and anxiety, or behavior that we consider quote unquote abnormal. Is this really a function of how society views people and behavior, and are medicines being assigned to people without an actual need for it to correct behaviors that aren't considered appropriate?
So, I hope there are no child psychiatrists here. None. Good. So there's this whole debate about the rising epidemic of ADHD. Everybody wants an ADHD prescription. Everybody wants to be on Ritalin or Mod Alert or something or the other. So somebody in the US, in the UK, who's kindly skeptical of all this, pointed out, what is the average playing area of a child in the 50s, 60s, 2000s, and now it's dropped down to around 20 square meters. Earlier, children could play in the street, they could play in the park, they felt safe, and now they are confined inside their house most of the time. A young child confined in the house will also have observant parents. Otherwise, the child was out of sight, out of mind. He's playing in the streets with his friends, he's running around, he's falling off trees, nobody gives a damn. But he falls off the dining table, he has ADHD. And give him Mod Alert. So the constraints that modern society has placed on human beings about the desire for conformity, and I think Herbert Marcuse wrote about this many, many years ago, the one-dimensional man. So if you force people to be very, very one-dimensional, everybody who's not one-dimensional can arrive at a psychiatric diagnosis. So that is a problem. That is a very real problem. Because our urges towards conformity and a very powerful insistence on conformity does create problems. And sometimes you do see psychiatry being used for those kinds of cosmetic changes in people's behaviors. The wellness industry is a classic example. Why should everybody be happier than they are all the time? And it's a bit, but it's an industry, so it follows the rules of the industry. As far as the drugs are concerned, there have been no new drugs in psychiatry from the 60s. That's also because we haven't invested or we haven't understood the biology of the brain in that much way. We understand cancers, we understand heart disease, we understand infections. We can invent a new antibiotic for COVID within a few months. We have not been able to invent a new drug for schizophrenia for 80 years. So the gap in the science space is also very high. And psychotherapy, of course, like I mentioned earlier, so you'll find that patient will come and demand CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, or I want this dialectic behavior therapy. Now, or if they are Indian trained, they'll want something like yoga, or they'll find something like some religious kind of reading the Gita. Now, the issue is that half of the therapeutic value of CBT is defined also by the mysticism of the West that Indians have. They want a foreign label to their therapy. If Indian label won't work, they want CBT. They want DBT. They don't want simple advice. They don't want a simple answer. Unless it's foreign approved, it is not good enough. So for psychotherapy, that creates a problem because you can't actually apply all those models to the Indian situation. You know, we had a patient who we thought had seasonal mood disorder, and she would get attacks of depression every year at approximately the same time. And so we writing up case reports, seasonal mood disorders. When you talk to her, she tells you, sir, every year it rains. I live on the side of the drain. Every year my heart gets washed off. So I get depressed when my heart gets washed off. So there goes the biology of circadian rhythms and seasonal mood disorders with the sheer physical reality that the heart gets washed off every year. And that's the cause for a depression every year. Now, unless we understand these kinds of lived experiences of patients, big models about psychiatry, the simplest models work best. So let's not build too complex a model. And those simple models are simple enough. Care, dignity, concern, humanness, politeness, decency. Those are good enough. There's one question further.
Good evening. It was a very interesting lecture. I have a different perspective of asking a question. Basically, a mental patient is being looked in a different way by our society, by our family, or by our relative. A patient, when he gets disorder, the entire family life in a house is disturbed. And people in other family members also may get disorder because of the tension. So treatment is being given to the patient. Patient is getting recovered. Things are happening. In such a case, what should be the role of immediate family member? What should be the role of society? And what should be the role of, government to make awareness about this illness or this? I just would like to know this.
I think that's a very real world question.
So what we try to do in our work is that, number one, we try to explain to the family members what the illness is, what it involves. We try to spend as much time as possible trying to understand how the family members are handling this problem. What do they understand? Are parts of the family members' behavior increasing the symptoms of the patient? In what way can that be improved? But at the rock bottom of it, you also need to understand that the family members also have to live a life of their own. And we often tell them, please do not, inverted commas, sacrifice your life because you have to look after somebody, especially siblings. You must get married. You must do the other things. You must go out. You must live life normal. Trying to carry this millstone around your neck of, I have to look after this person's mental illness, it's too much of a burden. So helping family members release that burden sometimes is very useful. Family members feel guilty that they are not doing enough for their ill relative. And sometimes you have to really draw the line that you are doing enough. Go out and do something for yourself also. So many of these things come up only when you interact with patients and their families over a long time. And I've been fortunate enough for all these years to follow up patients for almost their entire life. I still have patients I saw as a student in 1981. I'm still seeing them and their children and their grandchildren and their nephews and nieces. So it's only that kind of persistent commitment to individuals and their families that really helps the families. There is no simple answer to it. Because families have to be supported for a very long time if they have people with mental illness in their family. It is not a one-shot prescription. That must be understood. So please make sure that you get in touch with the psychiatric service, which will provide you that. And this may be years, but that's the only way it will work. As far as people are concerned, we can tell them that it's just an illness like blood pressure or diabetes, but nobody really believes that. You can tell them as many times it is just like a fever, it is just like something like any other illness. And they'll nod very nicely when you're talking to them, but in their heart of hearts, they don't believe it. So you also have to take a long time to reassure them that it is actually like that it will relapse, just like blood sugar falls or goes too high, you need admission for 5 days or 6 days. Whenever things go bad, come back to us, we'll admit for a few days, we'll do this. But now with the new systems, you can't offer that. So, but those kinds of revolving doors, that kind of help, that kind of emergency care is very, very necessary if people have to live comfortably. Earlier, we would have respite care. Somebody is mentally ill, there's a wedding, they can't take the person. Where do they keep them? So we'll say, just keep them with us for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, come back and take them home, and that will work. So it reduces family burden, it increases awareness, and you do whatever you can, basically. Sorry. Oh,
The every undergraduate
medical textbook has a whole section on psychiatry of several pages. Davidson book has, I think, about 150 pages, Kishore? Davidson has about 150 pages, approximately. Harrison's textbook of medicine has several hundred pages. And Goodman-Gilman textbook of pharmacology, which is the standard medical textbook for third year for pharmacology, the largest section in that book is on psychiatric drugs. So there's no reason why a reasonably educated physician who has studied in those 5 years and not done all kinds of other things is ignorant about the facets of psychiatry. Now, there has been an attempt over and over again to make sure that medical students typically read only for their long cases in their final exam. And psychiatric cases are never given as a long case. So nobody reads them. You read about cirrhosis, you read about neuropathy, you read about diabetes, you read about retinal disease, kidney disease, but never about psychiatry. So there has been a move to make sure that at random, at least one long case in psychiatry is given in every medical exam. Of course, we always rediscover the wheel. I went through the examination papers of 1905, and there was a psychiatry long case and a theory question in 1905. So we are finding out in 2020 what we have been doing from 1905, but that's India for you. But the general physicians typically are actually well equipped. It's simply that they're too pressured for time. And general practice in the private sector is a very different beast from PHC service and general hospital services in the periphery. And getting increasing medical awareness has its pluses and minuses. Now, for example, in England, almost everybody who goes to a GP will get a prescription for Prozac. So much so that the water content of the Thames River has several times the permissible levels of Prozac. It's creating problem for the fish and the frogs. You don't want very happy frogs jumping out. But that's a problem. So depression, anxiety are actually nuanced diagnosis when you should treat, for how long you should treat. And over medication can produce as much a problem as under medication. So as till the general medical practitioners can understand that aspect, otherwise the tendency is to start a drug and continue for 3 years. That can be dangerous. So it can be done. It is being done, at least in the formal education. Psychiatry is very much part of medical training. All medical colleges have a psychiatry department. All medical colleges have a psychiatry ward. It depends on the student as to how much time they spend in that service. I mean, I found it exceptionally interesting. So here I am as a psychiatrist for 45 years, but others don't. So.
Good evening, friends of Keshav, friends in the mental health space, and just friends. Thank you, Dr. Sanjeev, for a wonderful speech. He deserves it. You've done Keshav proud. I really felt I should not be speaking after this speech because there are so many thoughts jostling in my mind after hearing Dr. Sanjeev Jain. Why why Sri Lanka and Bengal had less number of patients, how racism and casteism permeated into the mental health space. Then the scientist who discovered election ink as well as translated Rilke, and madness being robbed of the allure and dignity. So many more things I want to think about, and I'm sure you all want to think about, but here Vandana and Mrinalini have asked me to come up. I wondered, when caste and race permeate the mental health space, surely gender does too, right? And I think we are twice discriminated. And the doctor gave us a chillingly lovely image of this beautiful dark long hair wound in the hand while the head is being beaten against the wall. I still can't get that image out of my mind. Thank you very much, doctor. I'm here, I think, more as a friend of Keshav. We all miss him. He was a true friend. And Bacon, in one of his essays, says that a friend is someone to whom you empty your joys, your sorrows, your griefs, your doubts, suspicions, and fears, like unto a confessional priest. Keshav was like that. Keshav was the most unactivist looking activist. There are many activists here. And you might ask, what does an activist look like? I'm not meaning it in a negative sense, but Keshav did not look like an activist. And if I have to describe him as what kind of an activist was he? I think he was an equality activist. I think he practiced the Constitution in his life. And when he walked into a bank wearing his veshti, nobody would have thought that he had made it his mission to carve the mental health structure, to institutionalize caring for the individual with dignity and love. He was just like us ordinary people. He didn't look different. That was the special thing about Keshav. And he never lost his sense of humor. For somebody who thought so passionately about this subject. He was always, I mean, he was ready for a laugh. Once I told him, Keshav, they've asked me to give a big speech on IP or something. I've retired. I don't want to do it. I'll tell them I retired. He was silent for a moment. It's not because you've retired that you don't want to give the speech, because you're lazy. I stopped for a minute. And after 2 days, I was there writing down the speech, which I had first said I won't speak, but he was like that. And you will forgive Keshav for saying you are lazy. In the foreword to the book which he co-edited, Healers or Predators, the question is raised why the heart of the medical profession is lost. But it's not just the heart of the medical profession. It's the heart, you might say, judiciary, executive, legislature, the corporate world. I don't know how much of heart there is in any of these spheres, but that book deals with medicine. Keshav, in that quotation from that book, it says, it's not only the medical profession, but also the civil services, the world of universities and higher education, world of lawyers and courts, the world of politics and public representation. Keshav partook of all these worlds directly, except perhaps the world of lawyers, but his heart was never lost. So he wanted to set right this malady, that is the loss of art. And he went about it in a systematic way. I mean, first understanding what the problem is, recognizing it, then finding out how to do it, then actually doing it. Some of us might go up to the first step, some of us up to the second, and not, I can't do it, somebody else will do it. Keshav was not like that. In the same book, one of the contributors says that our generation stood by and allowed the commercialization of medical education and industrialization of health and exploitation of patients in a cash economy. The contributor to this, I think, is a generation older than Keshav. But the later generation also stood by, I think, for a pretty much long time. Otherwise, we won't be here discussing the huge problems that Dr. Sanjeev Jain talked about. But Keshav did not stand by and watch. Keshav did what he could. And very often it's easy to become cynical about what a sorry past the world has come to. But the crowd that's gathered here and the crowd that's watching on Zoom is testimony to the fact that there are still people who recognize the unalloyed goodness that Keshav stood for. Thank you very much. And thank you all for being Keshav's friend. And thank you for asking me to
Good evening, everybody. It is indeed a great honor to be proposing a vote of thanks on the occasion of Keshav Desiraju's memorial lecture. The first person whom I would remember and personally thank is Vandana, who demonstrated admiration, love, loyalty, and deep sense of respect to Mr. Keshav Desiraju. And her persistence, hard work led to this particular event, coupled by the fact that Sanjeev took us through 250 years of history. Generally, history is boring, but he made it so fascinating to completely bring us new insights into what happened in the last 250 years. I will not hold you any longer. So I would like to thank all the board members of the Banyan, Mr. N. Ram, Mrs. Prabha Sridevan, Dr. Radha Krishnan, Mrs. Pungodai, and our board members, Mr. Shivakumar, Balraj, I don't know who else have come, and their deep sense of commitment for bringing in the developments that happened in the country in the last 10 years is indeed creditable. Mr. Keshav Desiraju is the only person who has been able to bring two important developments into our reality: the mental health policy and the Mental Health Act. In a short time, his persistence, his hard work, frequent meetings made this happen is a sense of great glory. And today, he must be definitely listening to what is happening in Chennai city. Look at that picture. He is intently looking at what everybody is saying. Thank you very much for your support, your encouragement, and your respect for Mr. Desiraju. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for coming here and gracing this occasion. We've got some snacks at the back with some goodie bags, and for those who cannot make it to, if you have to go back, there's goodie bags there as well. Please take it, because we've sort of curated a list of things that Mr. D would have liked. So yeah, thank you all for joining.